Have you ever wondered what the exact moment looks like when a man realizes he has lost absolutely everything? Is it a scream, a desperate plea for mercy, or is it something far more chilling? In my experience, it is usually just a profound, suffocating silence. It is the sound of a person realizing that the floor they have been standing on for years was never solid ground. It was a trapdoor I had been holding shut the entire time, just waiting for the right moment to step aside. The dining room at the steakhouse was dimly lit, the kind of place where the leather seats are soft and the shadows are deep. It was 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, a night where most men like my son-in-law Brad feel untouchable. He sat across from me, looking sharp in his tailored suit, a man who believed he was smarter than the game he was playing. He thought he was here for a standard, boring check-in about the company's quarterly projections. He took a sip of his bourbon, his movements relaxed, his eyes drifting toward the entrance, checking the room to see who might notice him with me. He was wearing that familiar, thin smile, the one that said he was playing his role perfectly. I didn't speak. I didn't even lean forward. I just watched him. I noticed the way his thumb rubbed against the rim of his glass. A small, nervous tick he thought he had hidden well. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was thinking that the old man was getting soft, that the company accounts were just numbers on a screen, and that no one was looking closely enough at the margins. He was wrong, of course. People like Brad always assume that because they cannot see the hunter, there is no hunter at all. I kept my phone face down on the table, a single text message glowing on the screen like a dormant fuse waiting to be lit. I wasn't angry. Anger is a weakness. It burns energy you should be saving for the kill. I was simply observant. I looked at the black leather binder resting beside my plate, a heavy, cold object that contained the entire blueprint of his downfall. It was filled with invoices, geolocation logs, and transaction timestamps. It was a monument to his greed. I reached out and slowly slid the binder across the polished mahogany table. It didn't make a sound. Brad stopped his glass halfway to his mouth, his eyes flickering down to the leather cover. He looked up at me, a confused, patronizing chuckle forming in his throat. He asked me what this was, trying to keep his voice light, trying to maintain the facade of a junior executive who had everything under control. I finally spoke, my voice steady, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of heat. I told him that he had spent $14,200 at a place called the Sapphire Suite on Tuesday night. The shift in his expression was immediate. It was like watching a light bulb shatter. The color didn't just drain from his face. It vanished, leaving him looking gray and hollowed out. He opened his mouth, probably to lie, to invent some excuse about client entertainment or a networking event gone wrong. But I didn't let him start. I told him that the problem wasn't the club itself. The problem was his arrogance. He had tried to expense that night as a consulting fee for the Midwest project, a lie so flimsy it wouldn't have fooled a summer intern, let alone someone like me. I told him I knew he was stealing from the company, but what really surprised me was that he was stupid enough to leave such a clear digital trail. To understand why Brad was so doomed in that moment, you have to understand who I am. I spent 25 years as a senior forensic auditor and a corporate risk analyst. My entire career was built on finding the things that people tried to bury. I didn't deal with human emotion. I dealt with human error. I saw the world in spreadsheets, in debit and credit columns, in the quiet gaps between numbers where people like Brad hide their sins. For 2.5 decades, I was the person corporations called when they realized their best employees were nothing more than parasites. I learned very early on that trust is the biggest liability a company can have. People will tell you that trust is the foundation of business, but trust is just an excuse for not checking the books. My philosophy was always simple. Data is an asset, and people are variables. I didn't treat my work as a job. It was a forensic examination of human greed. I knew how people lied, how they justified their thefts, and how they convinced themselves that they were entitled to what wasn't theirs. When Brad married my daughter, Chloe, I wanted to believe he was different. I wanted to see the best in him for her sake. I gave him a junior executive position, a salary that was far more than he earned, and a responsibility I thought would ground him. I gave him the keys to a piece of my professional world. I didn't realize then that I had just given a thief the combination to my vault. I spent those months watching him grow comfortable, watching the way he spent money that wasn't his, and watching his loyalty to my daughter slowly erode, replaced by a desperate, pathetic hunger for a lifestyle he hadn't earned. I watched it all, silently, waiting for the moment when he would finally cross the line from a simple mistake to an unforgivable betrayal. And that moment, as I sat across from him in that quiet restaurant, had finally arrived. It didn't happen all at once. That is the thing about people like Brad. They don't start out as villains. They start out as small, manageable disappointments. In the beginning, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a hungry, ambitious man looking to make a name for himself. He was charming. He was sharp enough to be useful, and he was, most importantly, the man my daughter Chloe had chosen. I watched him integrate into the company, sitting in meetings, taking notes, and occasionally offering an idea that wasn't entirely useless. I wanted to see him succeed, because if he succeeded, Chloe would be happy. That was my only agenda. But ambition is a dangerous thing when it isn't tempered by character. It creates a vacuum that greed fills very quickly. The first crack in the foundation was subtle. It was a receipt for a client dinner in mid-October. It was for a steakhouse across town, a place that served overpriced wine and catered to a crowd that had more money than sense. The amount was $300. It was a rounding error in our budget, something most managers wouldn't even glance at. But I am not most managers. My eyes are trained to catch the anomalies, the tiny, jagged edges in a sea of smooth numbers. I saw that receipt and felt a slight pull of curiosity. I didn't think he was stealing. I thought he was just being careless. Maybe he had brought a friend, or maybe he had just had a few too many drinks. I let it slide. I made a mental note to keep an eye on his expenses, thinking that maybe he just needed a little guidance on what counted as a legitimate business cost. But then, the small errors started to accumulate like dust in a corner. There were subscription fees for software that our IT department didn't even use. There were invoices for marketing consultations that seemed to come from companies that didn't appear to have any physical offices, just P.O. boxes and suspicious websites. I watched the logs. I watched the dates. I noticed that every time he had a late-night planning session, he submitted an expense report for a private car service. He was bleeding the company dry, not with one massive cinematic heist, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. He was testing the system, pushing the boundaries to see just how much he could take before someone noticed. He was playing a game of chicken with his father-in-law, and he was convinced he was winning. What made it truly painful, however, wasn't the money. It was watching Chloe. She was so proud of him. She would come to my office, her face glowing with excitement, telling me how hard Brad was working, how he was often out until the early hours of the morning securing new deals, how exhausted he was from the travel he had to do for the Midwest project. Every time she spoke, I felt a cold, sharp stone form in my chest. I knew he wasn't working. I knew he wasn't in the Midwest. I had the geolocation data on his company phone. I knew exactly where he was. He was in Las Vegas, at high-end casinos, or downtown at clubs that cost more for a single table than a junior analyst made in a month. He was building a life of luxury on a foundation of lies, and he was using my company and my daughter's trust to fund it. He began to change physically, too. The suits he wore became more expensive, the watches more prominent. He walked with a different gait, a kind of arrogant strut that suggested he felt invincible. He stopped asking me for advice and started talking over me in meetings, as if he were already the one in charge. He thought I was old, that I was out of touch, that I was too busy looking at the big picture to notice the petty theft happening right under my nose. He viewed me as a dinosaur, a man who had made his money in a different era and didn't understand the hustle. He didn't realize that the older you get, the more you understand how things work. He didn't realize that I wasn't watching him because I was slow. I was watching him because I was giving him enough rope to ensure that when the end came, there would be no way for him to climb back up. I remember sitting in my study at home, looking at a spreadsheet I had built specifically for him. It was a timeline of his life for the last 6 months. On one side, I had his official schedule, the meetings, the conferences, the client dinners. On the other side, I had the truth, the real receipts, the real locations, the real people he was with. The disparity was staggering. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was a total fabrication of his existence. He was a shadow, a fraud, wearing a mask of respectability. I could have fired him on the spot. I could have walked into his office, thrown the folder on his desk, and kicked him out of my building. But that wouldn't have been enough. Firing him would have made him the victim. He would have told Chloe that I was a jealous, controlling old man who didn't respect his ambition. He would have played the part of the martyr, and I would have lost my daughter in the process. I had to be smarter than that. I had to let him destroy himself so completely that there would be no room for his excuses. I needed to wait for the one mistake, the one big, undeniable, and utterly shameful act that would strip away his facade of success and leave him naked in the light. I needed the smoking gun, and I knew, given his ego and his mounting debts, that he would provide it. All I had to do was wait, be patient, and let him think he was the smartest person in the room. I kept my mouth shut. I maintained the same polite, professional distance, and I watched the numbers continue to climb, knowing that every dollar he took was another link in the chain that would eventually bind him. The stage was set, and the play was already in motion. All that remained was for him to take the final step. The investigation wasn't a sprint. It was a slow, calculated process that required the patience of a statue. I decided early on that a direct confrontation would be a waste of time. If I walked up to him with a handful of receipts, he would just lie. He would claim it was a mistake, an accident, or a misunderstanding. He would have played the victim, and I would have been left with nothing but a headache. Instead, I initiated what I called a shadow audit. I stopped acting like a father-in-law and started acting like the forensic professional I had been for 25 years. I wanted to see not just what he was doing, but exactly how far he was willing to go. I created a separate, encrypted file on my private server, a digital graveyard where I laid out every piece of evidence I gathered. I began by cross-referencing his corporate credit card statements with his travel itinerary. It was almost laughable how sloppy he was. He would submit a report claiming to be in Denver for a client conference, but the geolocation data on the company-issued card pinged him at a luxury lounge in Las Vegas. He wasn't even trying to hide his trail anymore. He was just assuming that no one was ever going to look. He was relying on the fact that the company was large enough and the expenses frequent enough that a single outlier would just get buried in the noise. He didn't realize that the noise was exactly what I was listening for. I took it a step further by monitoring his digital footprint within our internal network. I discovered that he wasn't just stealing money. He was accessing sensitive, proprietary files that he had no business touching. He was looking at private client lists and internal project budgets, trying to figure out how much he could realistically embezzle before the numbers stopped making sense. It was a classic move, the arrogance of a man who thinks he's smarter than the software. I set up an automated log that captured every single time he accessed these files, creating a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to his greed. I had hard evidence of unauthorized access, which was a much faster route to his termination than simple expense fraud. But even that felt too small. I didn't want to just fire him. I wanted him to destroy his own reputation so thoroughly that he would never work in this industry again. To do that, I needed to know exactly who he was with and what he was doing. I hired a private firm, a group of professionals I had worked with on a dozen major corporate investigations. I didn't give them much to do, just a simple request: observe his circle. They quickly found the truth. They reported on his late-night habits, the friends he was buying drinks for, the women, and the gambling dens. They provided me with photos, timestamps, and witness accounts. My folder was growing, turning into a comprehensive dossier on his double life. Every photograph was a nail in his coffin, and I was holding the hammer. Then came the final phase of my plan, the bait. I needed to catch him in an act so egregious, so undeniably criminal, that he couldn't possibly defend it. I authorized a massive corporate expense account for the so-called Midwest Project. I made sure he had access to a high-limit corporate card with almost no restrictions, provided it was used for business development. I watched him like a hawk. I knew his patterns. I knew his weaknesses. I knew that the second he had that much liquidity in his hands, he wouldn't be able to resist. He would treat it like a winning lottery ticket. I set up a specific, custom notification on my phone. The credit card processor had a feature that allowed for real-time alerts based on merchant category codes. I configured it to ping me immediately if a charge was made at a high-end nightlife establishment, a casino, or any venue that fell outside of standard business parameters. I sat at my desk, day after day, waiting. It was like fishing. I had cast the line. I had the hook set, and I was just waiting for the fish to bite. When the notification finally pinged on my phone, it was a quiet, unassuming sound. I didn't jump. I didn't feel a rush of excitement. I just looked at the screen, saw the location, saw the amount, and felt a cold, deep sense of satisfaction. He had finally done it. He had spent a fortune in one night, and he had done it using the card I had given him, specifically for the project I had laid out as a trap. He hadn't just stolen from the company. He had walked directly into a snare of his own design. He thought he was living the high life, but he was actually just paying for the evidence of his own ruin. It was a beautiful, elegant, and completely silent end to his games. I put my phone down, stood up, and began to prepare for the dinner that would end his life as he knew it. The trap was sprung, and the mouse was already in the box. The confrontation didn't happen with a shout or a dramatic standoff. It happened with the quiet slide of a leather binder across the mahogany table. I didn't say a word as I pushed it toward him. The sound of the leather rubbing against the wood was soft, but in that moment, it sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Brad looked at the binder, then back up at me. He had a smug, confused grin on his face, the kind of smile that only a man who has never been truly checked by consequences can wear. He asked me what this was, his voice carrying just enough arrogance to be grating. He still thought he was at a dinner with an aging, out-of-touch father-in-law. He had no idea he was sitting across from the man who had architected his professional obituary. I didn't answer his question immediately. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating. I watched his eyes dart toward the binder. He knew, deep down, that something was wrong. His confidence was a thin veneer, and it was beginning to crack under the weight of my stare. Finally, I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke in the flat, monotonous tone of a man reading a balance sheet. I told him he had spent $14,200 at the Sapphire Suite on Tuesday night. His reaction was exactly what I had predicted. The smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a momentary, deer-in-the-headlights freeze. He blinked, once, twice, trying to process the information. Then, he went for the lie. He opened his mouth, stammering something about a miscalculation, a clerical error, perhaps a business meeting that had taken an unexpected turn. He started to spin a tale about client entertainment and the high-stakes world of the Midwest project. It was a pathetic, rehearsed response, the kind of excuse a teenager gives when they've been caught skipping class. He didn't realize that every word he spoke was just another brick in the wall I was building around him. I let him finish his lie. I didn't interrupt. I just watched him sweat. When he finally stopped, the silence returned, sharper than before. I told him that the club wasn't the problem. I told him that I didn't care where he spent his free time, provided he was spending his own money. But he hadn't used his own money. He had used the company's, and he had tried to mask it as a consulting expense. That was the mistake. That was the variable that turned a bad habit into a criminal offense. I told him that the Midwest project didn't exist in the way he described it, and that I had the geolocation data to prove he was nowhere near any client meetings on that Tuesday. He tried to bluff one last time. He leaned back in his chair, trying to reclaim his composure, and accused me of paranoia. He asked me if I was really going to make a scene over a rounding error in a budget. That was when I pulled out my phone. I didn't unlock it or show him any apps. I just placed it on the table between us. I told him that the credit card processor had a feature, one that I had personally configured for every single card I issued. It was a real-time notification system. I explained that at exactly 2:41 in the morning, my phone had buzzed. It hadn't been a notification from the bank's fraud department. It had been a direct alert, because the transaction was flagged as a high-risk nightlife establishment. The look on his face shifted then. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. He realized then that he hadn't just been caught, he had been observed. He realized that the old man hadn't been asleep at the wheel. I had been watching him the entire time, cataloging his every move, every swipe of the card, every lie. He stared at the phone as if it were a bomb. I told him the details of the charge, the bottle service, the VIP suite, the specific dollar amount that was now sitting in the company's internal review log. He reached for his glass, his hand shaking so violently that the ice rattled against the crystal. He couldn't drink. He couldn't speak. He just sat there, the air leaving his lungs in short, jagged gasps. He had spent months convincing himself that he was the smartest person in the room, that he was running the game. And in a matter of seconds, I had peeled back the curtain and shown him that he wasn't even a player. He was just a variable that I was about to delete from the equation. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like exactly what he was, a thief who had finally been cornered by the very system he thought he had mastered. He didn't even try to lie again. He just stared at the table, realizing that his life, as he knew it, was effectively over. The reversal was total. The predator had become the prey, and the silence in that room was the sound of a man watching his future evaporate. I didn't let him sit in his misery for long. The shock was starting to wear off, and I could see his mind scrambling, trying to find a corner he could back into, a loophole he could exploit. I didn't give him the chance. I opened the black leather binder. I didn't show him the photographs of the clubs or the detailed geolocation maps. He already knew exactly what he had done. Instead, I pulled out 3 pieces of thick, crisp paper. The first was a letter of immediate resignation. effective that exact minute. The second was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, barring him from ever discussing the company, my family, or this dinner. The third was a formal confession of corporate malfeasance, detailing the exact amount of money he had stolen, down to the very last cent. I slid a heavy silver pen across the table. It rolled and stopped right against his water glass. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him he had two choices. He could sign all three documents right now, walk out of the restaurant, and never speak to my daughter, or step foot in my building again. Or he could stand up, refuse to sign, and I would hand the entire binder over to the district attorney's office before he even made it to the parking garage. I reminded him that embezzlement of company funds over $10,000 is a serious felony. I let that word hang in the air for a long moment. Felony. I watched his eyes track the letters on the confession page. There was no negotiation. There was no begging, because he looked into my face and saw a man who would not be moved by tears or apologies. His hands shook so badly that he could barely grip the silver pen, but he signed. He signed away his job, his reputation, and his marriage, all in the span of 90 seconds. He didn't even read the clauses stating he would forfeit his remaining salary and bonuses to cover the stolen funds. He was just trying to survive the night. I took the papers back, closed the binder, and told him the meal was on me. He stood up, looking like a hollow shell of the man who had walked in and left. But my job wasn't finished. Removing a cancer from a company is a simple administrative task. Removing it from a family is much harder. I drove straight to my daughter's house that same night. This was the only part of the plan I dreaded. I am a man of facts and figures, not a man of emotional comfort. But I knew that if I didn't show her the absolute truth immediately, Brad would try to spin a lie. He would try to tell her I forced him out because I was jealous or controlling. I sat Chloe down at her kitchen table. I didn't yell. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just opened a smaller, sanitized folder. I showed her the dates he promised he was working late, placed right next to the credit card receipts from the VIP lounges. I laid out the cold, undeniable math of his betrayal. I sat there and watched my daughter's heart break in real time. It was the only moment in this entire process where I felt a flash of true, burning anger. I wanted to find him and hurt him physically, but I pushed it down. Anger makes you stupid. I stayed calm. She cried, she asked questions, and I answered them with quiet, gentle honesty. By the time the sun came up, the illusion was shattered. Brad's bags were packed and left on the front porch. The divorce that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely in her favor, heavily supported by the confession he had signed at the steakhouse. As for Brad's professional life, he quickly found out that my reach extended far beyond the walls of my own office. I didn't publish his confession online. I didn't go to the press. I didn't need to do any of that. The high-level corporate world is a very small, very quiet neighborhood. When a junior executive abruptly resigns without notice, and his powerful father-in-law refuses to provide a reference, people talk. I made a few quiet phone calls to the right people in the industry. I didn't make grand accusations. I simply said he was not a good fit for a culture of strict integrity. That was all it took. He was completely blackballed. He lost his status, his expensive suits, and the luxurious life he thought he was entitled to. He became exactly what his numbers showed he was, a liability. People often think revenge is an explosion. They think it is shouting matches, thrown punches, broken glass, and slashed tires. They think it is a wildfire that burns everything down, including the person who lit it. It isn't. Real revenge is a surgical procedure. It is the careful, methodical removal of a problem. Anger is a hot reaction, and hot reactions lead to careless mistakes. Justice, true justice, is cold. It is precise and calculated. Greed is always loud, always screaming for more attention, more money, more status. But precision is completely silent. Brad thought he was playing a brilliant game. He thought he was outsmarting an old man who only cared about boring spreadsheets. But he never realized that I was the one who wrote the rules of the board he was playing on. He thought the numbers were just tedious details, completely missing the fact that the numbers are the only things that always tell the truth. Watch who you let into your inner circle. Keep your eyes open. Verify every claim, and always audit your own life before someone else decides to do it for you. If you appreciate the art of a cold, calculated strategy, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are always more files to open, and always more stories where the numbers catch the thief.